Welcome back. Now, we've talked about getting organized and we've talked about understanding values. Next, let's talk about how to prioritize important locations in your town so that you can then choose actions that help take care of the specific resources that are there. Prioritization is necessary because it allows us to take a big picture look at what's in your community and then determine what actually needs the most attention from an ecological perspective. One of the reasons that this is useful is that sometimes the issues or the resources that we're most familiar with aren't actually the ones that need attention from an ecological perspective. So I'm going to outline a prioritization process that you can use that integrates natural resources data and the community values that we've been talking about. We know that sometimes the data alone indicates standout natural resource needs, so our discussion of prioritization is going to start with a discussion of these mapped data. Then we'll talk about how to integrate community values. Front-loading maps and other data and discussions about prioritization can help us show which resources and locations are most vulnerable, and those might be good places to start our efforts. Now, to figure out exactly where you should focus first, we're going to talk about how to identify two types of priority locations based on their scale, and then we'll talk more about the specific components later on. The locations of landscape scale features are important for maintaining ecological function at a grand scale. These are things like forests and waterways, landscape scale features that provide the foundation for everything else. Then we'll zoom in and look at species or natural community scale resources. These are discrete features like wildlife road crossings and rare species, and they're important at a very different scale. We would do different things with features at this scale. Now, this is only a suggested prioritization process that we hope will help you to decide where your local efforts will have the greatest impact. We also hope it will help you blend science and community values. So with this in mind, here's an overview of the 6 prioritization steps that we'll talk about. Here we'll be providing just a brief overview, but this process is described in a lot of detail in a publication that'll be coming out soon called Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage. So keep your eyes open for that publication. Now, the first 3 steps of the 6-step series are really about determining the ecological context. We're going to locate priorities at that landscape scale, like I mentioned, the big forests and the waterways. We'll zoom in and locate priorities at the species or natural community scale. Then we'll figure out, well, which are the actual components within those priority areas that we want to look at and focus on more. Next, we'll bring in areas of high public value. These are places that are important to your community, whether or not they have important ecological function. And the 5th and 6th steps are about establishing a range of options, brainstorming what you can do to protect the resources and these public values, and then eventually evaluating and choosing options. And we'll come back to these steps one by one. So here we go. The very first step is going to be to locate priorities at the landscape scale. Now, what do I mean by the landscape scale? A landscape scale feature is something that takes up vast areas of land, like the forests or the waterways. And the forests, looking at not just the blocks of forest, but the way they connect across the landscape. At this scale, we'll also include the physical landscape, the bedrock, and the geological formations that are the basis for everything that lives on top, the hills, the valleys, the coves. Now, why is this important? This is important because these features cross political boundaries, and they provide a foundation on which everything else happens. Individual features like riparian habitat or rare species, these are important too, but unless they have healthy surroundings, then those features are not going to thrive. These landscape scale features are mapped on BioFinder, an online mapping tool that's available to the public. This tool has recently been updated to include this information, which is new to the Agency of Natural Resources. Now, on BioFinder, these landscape scale features are grouped into categories according to whether they're highest priority, or not such a priority. So the highest priority elements here on the map are in darker green, the priority are in lighter green, and the gray or white areas are where those highest priority or priority resources are not found. So this is really a filter for dividing the landscape into places that are the most important for ecological function before zooming in and looking at individual features of the landscape. Now, you probably noticed that much of the state is covered with these priority areas, and I want to emphasize that these are not areas that are off limits. These are places to manage for ecological function. There are so many activities like forestry and recreation that can take place there and maintain ecological function. And our recommendations are really to try to focus development efforts on the edges and maintain connectivity between these areas. But still, knowing about these priority areas is helpful because it allows us to point to locations to pay attention to when we're planning for the best ways to use land as we move forward. All right, so for step 2, we're going to zoom in. Now on this map, the darker green and the lighter green areas represent the same landscape scale priorities that we saw in the last slide. And these are the areas that support much of Vermont's biodiversity. But now we've also added the purple and the blue. These are species and community scale priorities. And these tend to be smaller in size, but they're important because they represent specialized habitats that certain species rely on. The darker blue are the highest priority, and the purple are priority. This information can also be found on the BioFinder website. Now, species and natural communities elements include things like wildlife road crossings, wetlands, mast stands. And these locations aren't any more or less important than the highest priority and priority layers in the dark green and light green, but they often encompass a much smaller amount of acreage, which means that they can be very vulnerable. So for example, if we were to lose a half acre of something that covers only 1 acre total, then that means a whole species or a high percentage of a natural community might be wiped out in that area. And so because these discrete areas can be very vulnerable, they indicate places where it might be more appropriate to focus strong protections with the strongest protection measures for the highest priority areas. So once you've identified the priority areas at those 2 different scales, the next step is going to be to figure out what elements exactly make up those priority areas. Are these wetlands? Are these riparian areas? Are they forests? What are they? You can use BioFinder to do this, or you can refer to Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage, the publication that should be coming out soon that I mentioned earlier. Now, in some locations, you may find that there's more than one component present. And when multiple components are present in the same area, it's likely that these areas have extra high value. They're like hotspots of activity, and these might be good focal points for efforts. Why are we identifying the components right here? It's really the components, not the locations, that are going to tell us what we should do in order to move forward. So, for example, the function of the interior part of a large forest block is a lot more vulnerable to negative impacts from development than the forest along the edges of that block. And so we might want to focus development efforts on the sides of that block instead of allowing them to penetrate through the middle. I'd like to share an example that illustrates this idea of prioritizing using different scales, and this brings us to the Mad River Valley. Now, this project took place in 3 towns, Fayston, Waitsfield, and Warren, and this is an area that has abundant forest. It includes pieces of the Green Mountain National Forest and Camel's Hump State Forest. And this was part of a grant-funded project where the 3 towns received technical assistance to prioritize their local resources. They had already done a detailed professional natural resources inventory, and so these maps are based on that data. It doesn't use the state data that I showed a few minutes ago, but essentially they put together maps that represent the same information. Now, on this map, they have the highest priority areas, or the most sensitive areas, are mapped in this red color. These are areas where the towns discuss prohibiting or limiting development because of their sensitivity and because this is a small acreage of the overall town. As the colors get lighter, the areas get less sensitive. And so in that next tier of orange, the communities discussed that they might encourage cluster development and avoid penetrating roads or other developments into these sensitive areas. Now, those first 3 steps help us to understand areas of ecological importance, but for any community, there's going to be more to it than that. The next step is going to be to combine that data with information about your community's values. The combination of the two will tell you about areas with multiple values, or areas that we call areas of high public value. Since we've been focusing on location, a good way to capture these different types of values is to use your natural resources maps and combine them with your community values maps if you have them, and then note where there are multiple values present in a single space or for a particular resource. But we can also notice where there are disconnects, as well as how priorities might vary in different parts of town. And this tells us what's happening across the town and will guide you in how you might focus your efforts. By finding overlap with locations of high ecological value and locations of high community value, many times towns will find that protecting ecological value is actually a step toward achieving other community goals. Now, you may also realize that sometimes areas with high ecological value are worthy of protection, even if they weren't circled on the community values maps. The opposite might be areas that are so important to the community that you'll prioritize them even though they weren't ecological priorities. And in these cases, you might choose to identify areas of high community value that aren't necessarily areas of overlap. You might wonder, what happens if the areas that are important to the community don't overlap with those highest priority ecological locations? For example, rare plants like this lady slipper rarely come up in community values mapping as something that people value, even though science tells us that these are important for maintaining biodiversity. So this is an example of where you'd want to use science to inform your community values by highlighting things that aren't always right at the forefront of the community. Now, even when you do have science at the forefront of the conversation and the data indicate that certain things are important, your community may choose to prioritize other locations, and that's absolutely fine. But this process of looking at both community values and the natural resource values helps us to clarify why we're making particular decisions. Because as we said earlier, planning is about acknowledging these tensions and making decisions with an awareness. The next step is to brainstorm a list of actions that you can take to restore those areas based on what components are there. A good place to start is by reviewing what options are available, and there are many resources that can help with this process. Vermont Natural Resources Council has several resources. Community Strategies for Vermont's Forests and Wildlife is a guide, a book that provides a toolbox of regulatory and non-regulatory options to help with natural resource concerns. The same organization has a community planning toolbox available online. The Agency of Natural Resources has a couple options as well. Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage gives lots of background information about the important natural resources on the landscape. And I've mentioned Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage, which is a sister to that guide that really focuses on how to interpret a lot of mapping information. Your municipal plan might also give you some guidance over what people value in your town and possibly even some suggestions that have already been posed for how to move forward. Now, the important step here is we're putting everything on the table right now. So this is a place to brainstorm and think about everything, things that you haven't thought of in this process yet. Now, first in this process, look at what components are found in these priority areas that you've identified. Then make a list of actions that could support each of these components. When you create this list of possible actions, we recommend putting everything on the table that could possibly help you address your community's natural resource priorities. Even if you don't think something is likely to fly in your town or you don't think it's the best option, we suggest just putting it on the table now, putting it on that list, and you can always weed through this list later on. After you've brainstormed strategies, the next step is to evaluate them. So For each strategy, you can think about, well, does it actually advance the natural resource needs? This might sound obvious, but it's really good to just check back and make sure. Does it support community values? If so, it might garner a lot more support. How much effort will it take to get it done? And make sure you are realistic as you do make this assessment. How much local capacity is required? What will it cost? Are there funding sources that you know of? It's important, again, to have a realistic view of this. Who else can help? Are there people available to help out? For locations in which more than one component is present, see if you can find strategies that'll serve multiple components at once as well. And throughout your process, think about strategies that are compatible with the values of your community too. Even if you have a gut sense of what solutions might work best, it can be really helpful to evaluate solutions against specific criteria like this list. First, it helps you look at the solution from all angles. And secondly, it shows you how you arrived at the suggested solution that you're going to move forward. And so there it can support transparency as you move those strategies forward to the community. Including the public in this process will help you get a better idea of what's feasible, and it'll also help you generate support. This step is really a chance to people about what you're planning to do and why. It's a chance to share how you prioritized and emphasize the whole range of natural resources and community values that are being covered. It's also a chance to get new ideas. You might think you know what you're moving forward, but after all, at the end of this, what you really want is a set of tools that make sense. Now, one way to focus the brainstorming is to really let people know about the whole variety of values you considered, what the data say, what the community has said. It's useful to emphasize what community members have said that's important, not just why it matters to the people who have been working on it the most. Bring in the community. Now, since this is a brainstorm, not all ideas will be used, but it's important to that ideas will be sorted based on their impact, their feasibility, and other factors as well. When you're evaluating these options, we recommend that you keep track of how they were evaluated. Even if you don't use an idea, it's nice to acknowledge it and be able to say why you didn't use it. You should be prepared to report out to the community on how ideas were handled and why they were handled that way. Concrete comments to community responses can go a long way. And then finally, we'll reach the moment that you've been waiting for when we finalize the set of recommendations and you're set to move ahead with them.